We welcome all the community members to today's program through the eyes of the plants. Cindy Larson Moura is the co-owner of Prickly Ed's Cactus Patch, a locally owned small business focused on providing the plants, information, and empowerment that people need to artfully build back habitat at their own homes and in their communities. Before helping launch and run Prickly Ed's, Cindy spent decades running nonprofit organizations and initiatives locally as well as nationwide. Now, she regularly conducts and coordinates workshops focused on gardening with nature and actively engages with local environmental leaders to provide a heightened awareness of biodiversity challenges and solutions for our region. Cindy authors ecological gardening content for several publications, including our local East Bay Life and the Massachusetts Pollinator Network quarterly newsletter. A longtime Barrington resident and lifelong gardener, Cindy and her husband, Prickly Ed, do all of the design, implementation, and management for their ever-evolving 5+ acre wildscape, which straddles Barrington, Rhode Island, and Swansea, Mass., and is a certified wildlife habitat, a stop on the pollinator pathway, and the site of an active biodiversity audit, and a wonderful place to visit if you've never been there. Today, Sydney is going to present an in-depth story for 12 native plant species and how they function in the landscape, and maybe help give us confidence to select plants that meet our gardening goals while also providing a boost to the region's biodiversity. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see many familiar faces, and it's nice to meet many new people today as well. Jane just did such a fabulous introduction that I'm going to get to skip a couple of my early slides, so that's a great thing. One bit of context that I would like to give before I get started. In general, with questions, if I'm saying something or talking about something that does not make a lot of sense in the moment, please feel free to raise your hand. I will repeat the question back so people can hear it. But in general, we'll wait till the end for some of those particular questions that may be top of mind for you. And we have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to cover questions you might have about your own landscape or native plants in general. So as Jane said, we're going to be exploring the topic of native plants through the lens of 12 specific plants today, and learning from their stories what you can also learn in terms of questions you may want to ask or things you might want to think about when choosing plants for your own space. I'll go back real quickly, but we've already introduced ourselves. I'm Cindy, and Ed is in the back from Prickly Ed's Cactus Patch. And our goal is not just to sell plants, which is something that we do enthusiastically from April through October. It's really to inspire and empower people to invite nature back into our individual yards and into our community. And at the root of that are native plants. We also are active gardeners. We currently have more than 250 species of native plants growing right in our own residential yard. And so I've learned a lot about plants from growing them and also from the plants that I have not been all that successful at growing. And in reality, that is one of the ways that you learn a lot about plants. So before we get started and dig in on 12 plants, I want to give a little bit of broader context and think about this from the lens of, if I were a native plant, what might I want people to know about me and to know about how I might behave in a landscape as a result of that? So by a show of hands, how many people are at least familiar with the term native plant, feel like you've heard it talked about? And this is a really encouraging show of hands because just a few years ago, standing in this same auditorium, I feel like the number of hands would have been very different. So this is one of the fastest growing trends in gardening. Native plants are often not the plants we've been gardening with. They were the plants that were sort of here in this place originally. And I'm going to tell their story briefly with a quick look at history. As many of you know, and as I imagine many of you are very involved with, we're celebrating 250 years this year. There's a lot happening in Barrington around this celebration, and this 250-year mark was significant as I was thinking about this presentation, because that 250 years is really just a blink in time in terms of the amount of time that native plants have been here, evolving and growing in this landscape. How did those plants get here? If we didn't bring them and we didn't plant them, how did they arrive? A quick look back to school for those of you who can remember. I barely can, so you're all doing better than me if you can remember those school years. But at one time, where we're standing and sitting right now was under a huge sheet of ice. It was more than a mile thick in many places, and there was very little life here until about 20,000 years ago. And think about that number, 20,000, in comparison to the 250 number. But then that ice moved back, and as it moved back, life was also able to come back. And that's when the plants that we catalog and refer to as native plants started to regrow in our region. They didn't just magically appear, they actually moved in from the edges that were just beyond that ice sheet. So although that was 12 to 15,000 years ago, many of those plants are actually quite a bit older than that, and we're going to talk about a couple of those. But first, one of the reasons why I wanted to emphasize this, sort of on behalf of the plants we're talking about, is because it impacts our soil. How many people are gardeners? Just because you're here for a garden event, I don't want to assume that you're a gardener, but I assume that most are and have a pretty good familiarity with the importance of soil and how we think about soil. So often we spend a lot of time amending the soil, trying to improve the soil, trying to change the soil so that we can grow particular plants in it. The beauty of native plants is that they actually evolved to grow in the soil that's right here. And that is that very rocky, sandy, clay soil that naturally occurred because of the events that happened. Those rocks that you hit when you're digging, how many people hit rocks when they're digging? Those are there for a reason. I often thought we would sometimes say in our yard, not even thinking, again, forgetting back to those school days, we would often say, who dumped all these rocks here? Was this an excavation pit? What the heck is going on here? But in reality, that's part of the history and the fabric of the land that we're on. And in reality, many of the plants are actually incredibly well adapted to just adjust to those conditions without us spending so much time and adding so many products to make it different. So back to that snap in history where I talked about a window of time, although the plants came back and began to thrive here a little more than 12,000 years ago, some of those plants were incredibly old. Some of them that returned were ancient plants, in fact. Who knows Princess Pine? I thought that this might be one that folks in a garden club would be familiar with, because Princess Pine is a plant that we've used over the last decades for decoration at holiday time. There are fossil records of that plant more than 400 million years ago. It is an ancient plant, and it takes an incredibly long time to grow. A population of those plants can take more than 100 years to grow, and in the process of doing that, it does incredible things for the soil in that woodland area in terms of improving it and enriching it to help other plants also thrive in that same community. Ferns are another example of an ancient plant. And I had to get ferns in here, even though they're not one of my 12 plants, just because they are such a significant and interesting plant in terms of the story of this place that we're in. This little shady patch, which has ferns and ginger and other things, is a favorite spot for fireflies who like those shady, moist areas. So if you have shade and feel like you're sometimes struggling with it, consider ferns. They can be a great solution. We have more than 50 varieties that are native here. I guarantee there are some that will work in every single shady spot that you might have in a landscape. And just a fun fact, ferns are older than dinosaurs. So imagine what those plants have gone through during that time in terms of evolving and sort of thinking about and learning from the land and learning about being here in terms of their own ability to survive without lots of intervention from all of us. Some of our native plants are living examples of natural adaptations. So the other really interesting thing about these native plants that have been here for so long, they have developed these adaptations and this sort of codependence with pollinators and birds and other wildlife. Prickly pear cactus is part of where the name for our business came from, because it is such an interesting example of a plant that has adapted to benefit. Who knew, it might be not fair to ask this in Barrington, where I know many of you do know this, but who knew that we have a cactus that is native to Rhode Island? It feels unusual. It feels like cactus should be out in Arizona or somewhere, but we do have our own native cactus. It's a fun plant to plant. It's a well-adapted plant to plant, but the other thing that's really cool about it is it's also incredibly beneficial. The flowers that bloom in June with those bright yellow blooms are not only visited by pollinators, they're visited by some of our rare and endangered bees. So it's not just the common pollinators that you might see there. This is a plant that's been here so long that some really fascinating pollinators have learned to utilize it in important ways. And those prickly pear fruit, if you're not brave enough to harvest them, some people are, but if you're not, then they're relished by wildlife. Turtles love them. Wild turkeys love them. And even our favorite town coyotes will come and eat the prickly pear. So this is also a plant that shows us a lot about weather adaptation. How many people in these last few years, and now I feel like it's going on more than a few years, in the early spring when we get those late cold snaps, are having impacts with some of their flowering shrubs and trees and things? It's getting trickier and trickier with some of our plants. This plant does a really great job of showing us exactly how a native plant has learned to survive. In the winter, those sort of crusty, kind of uglyish looking pictures, it's gone completely dormant. And the fluid has gone out of the pads, and that's how it survives the winter. Then in the summer, that picture of those beautiful green, vibrant pads, that was in the middle of drought, having never been watered. It has never been artificially watered one time even, or fertilized, or anything. Native plants play an essential role in the landscape that supported life here for thousands of years, and we often talk about those plants as having supported pollinators and wildlife and other creatures. But those plants also supported humans. So who is familiar with the plant that's here with the monarch butterfly? Joe Pye weed. Does anyone know how and when, or the legend, no one has proven the legend, but it is a long shared one, the legend of how we started calling it Joe Pye weed? Back in the late 1600s, there was a well-known medicine man, a Native American medicine man in Massachusetts, who helped early settlers learn how to utilize the native plants that were here to treat some of the diseases. They started calling him Joe Pye, and the Joe Pye weed, which was used for centuries as an antibacterial, then started to be called that as well. So it's very cool to think about these plants as not only benefiting pollinators, but that long history of really interesting things they did, so that in many ways we could all be here today too. Our region is home to a remarkable diversity of native plants. I'm going to just grab water, which is not great for video, but I'll do it anyway. So before I started I was talking to Jane Donnelly, who I'm sure you all know, and we were talking about the specific list of plants that are native to Rhode Island. Our Rhode Island cataloged plant list has 1,300 varieties, which is a lot in and of itself if you think about how many native plants we know and how many we use. But if you just expand to the border of Massachusetts, which is easy to do, my property is literally in both of those states, you bump up to 2,500 plants. And if you bump just a little bit outside of New England to the northeast, you go to 3,500 plants. So all that to say, there is an endless supply of plants. Many of these native plants want to be planted in very particular environments and behave in particular ways, and we're going to talk about and feature some of those. But I guarantee, out of that whole list of plants, there are many that will work in almost any setting in any way you need them to. But despite really fascinating history, and the more I learn about them, the more fascinated I become with some of the history and how essential they are to our environment and our ecosystems, they have historically represented just a tiny percentage of the plants we've used in managed landscapes. Right now, in nurseries, around 20% of plants that are sold are native plants, which sounds like not a very high number, but that's actually double what it was just a few years ago. So that 20% is a rapid doubling, but still very low. On average, plants in our suburban landscapes, maybe 21% are native plants. But even more importantly, for folks who spend a lot of time in nature, there's not even a guarantee that the plants that you're seeing out in the woods and the wilderness of our area are native plants, because more than 30% of them are actually non-native invasive plants at this point. So it does mean taking a little bit of an extra step to learn about and know them and figure out how we might use and incorporate them. But all this begs the question, if they're so well adapted, right? I could spend the next 3 hours telling you all of the reasons we should all be planting native plants. If they're so well adapted, they're so essential, they're rooted in a fascinating history, then why wouldn't we be using them in landscapes? Why haven't they dominated landscapes? And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to highlight a couple before we talk about our featured plants. But the real overarching theme of that is that the history that extends far beyond us in this room of utilizing plants in our landscapes has really been very much rooted in food production and ornamental horticulture. Those are the two things that have dominated that industry really since the 1800s. And in both of those things, you want and need, not just want, but need a level of control. If you're designing something to look a particular way, you're going to need the plants to do that. If you're growing food to eat, you're going to need it to produce in a particular way. Native plants in general are here for a different reason and have a different job. These are working plants with a determination to survive and thrive because the ecosystem depends on them. And so they have some behaviors that make them what is often perceived as challenging to manage in a landscape. There's a brand new book out that I love. We'll have to make sure it makes its way to the library if it's not here yet. I didn't check. It's called Your Natural Garden, and it's written by Kelly Norris, a designer who just won some fabulous medals in the Philadelphia Garden Show a week or so ago. And he wrote, "A reasonable gardener would think, what if things get out of control? What if I plant some of these plants and they're suddenly unruly and get out of control?" Whereas a natural gardener's thought process tends to be, what if they exceed all expectations, right? What if it's fabulous because suddenly they're spreading and I don't need to plant new things and they're thriving and reproducing on their own and doing all of the things that we might possibly want for our ecosystem. But that's not so much how we think about gardening today. Another reason that people often don't love native plants is this perception that they get very tall. And it is not an incorrect perception. While there are many low-growing native plants, the majority that we regularly use in landscapes do tend to grow fairly tall. They also may grow unreliably in terms of height. You might read that it's going to go 3 feet, and tomorrow it might be 5 feet. It's sort of a little more difficult to know. The reason for that really goes back to survival. These plants are meant to grow in very densely knit plant communities. And so to get the sunlight and other nutrients they need, they're out competing each other with their growth. It also makes them more visible to pollinators. So the flowers are trying to rise up above. Now, that said, there are also garden conditions that can exaggerate the height and either have something growing taller than it's meant to, or have something seem taller than it should. One of the things which I myself have realized I can be unintentionally guilty of is having rich garden soil. So over time, if you've either amended it, or even if you've planted a lot of plants and left leaves and done other things that make your soil richer, that's going to help a plant grow potentially 2 or 3 feet taller than it was ever supposed to. So that's just something to be aware of, that many of these plants behave their best in a leaner soil. Also, it does require thinking about what they get planted with. So a very tall plant by itself is very likely going to flop over and do all sorts of things that aren't going to feel really great in a garden, whereas a group of them planted together very strategically can actually make a really interesting accent in a space. And the other thing to keep in mind, some people see this as a critique. I actually see it as the beauty and the fun of using these plants. The landscape literally changes every single year, even if you do nothing. So because of their adaptations, in a year with a lot of rain, different plants are going to thrive and really come into the spotlight versus a year of drought where a different group of plants might really come into the spotlight. These plants also like to move around, and we're going to feature a plant that's notorious for that, but they don't always stay where they're put. It doesn't mean they leave your yard, but they might not stay in the exact spot. Now, if you embrace that and you think, how fun would it be that every year my yard could look a little different and be a little bit of a different experience? It's just a different way of thinking about things. I'm almost at the 12 plants, but before I do that, I do want to say that I've said some things that may have encouraged some people to be excited about native plants and might have frightened some others even more. But I want to make it clear that in that catalog of native plants, and in particular when we extend to the Northeast region and think about those 3,500 varieties that are available, there are actually some very ornamental and pretty well-behaved even native plants that can be used in a variety of ways that you might just sub out for an ornamental plant you're using right now. One thing that's really on the rise, and I think is fun to experiment with, is even container gardening with native plants. That's great because it's just a different way of showcasing them. It's also great because that means even somebody with just a balcony can utilize them in some way. This planter I thought was just beautiful. It's got a Christmas fern, a coral bell, some wintergreen, and a sedge, a couple of little pumpkins, and you have an autumn display that's made out of plants that will come back next year. So it's also great for saving on resources. And if I were only going to feature plants that are very ornamental and very easily used in that way, some of the ones that I might mention, these are not my featured plants, but I might mention something like a plant that's common name is literally short and sweet. What is not to love about a plant that you call short and sweet? It stays short, it stays compact, it has beautiful, delicate flowers, and it even has a cultivar cousin, which is a new one that has raged onto the garden scene called Jackson Valentine, which gets a little bit taller. It's not quite as short and sweet, and it's very red and very vibrant, and I have heard that hummingbirds love it. Again, that's not one of the plants yet, though, but if you wanted to buy it for your garden, I wouldn't hold it against you. Spagilia, our woodland pinkroot. Every single year, people wait for these to arrive. Such a fun plant. It's just a decorative burst of red color in a shady woodland area. How rare is that to have something like that? And one that I personally am very excited for, because I'm using it in an experimental container rock garden, is a plant called prairie smoke. Have you ever seen this one before? This is not a New England native. It is a Northeast native, very compact growth, super fun flowers, will literally grow in rocks. It's going to be very fun to play with. But I did not pick any of these plants to feature because the role of native plants is not just to decorate. It's totally okay. I mean, it's not up to me to say it's okay, but I'm going to say it's okay. It's totally okay to use them to decorate. I do it all the time. I think it's a great idea because I think it's a great way to get more people excited about it. But ultimately, I would be doing a disservice if the plants I featured only did that and didn't do other things. Because the shift to using native plants is really rooted in environmental stewardship and a desire to bring habitat back to our own yards and our communities. So the 12 plants I picked today all had to meet a certain characteristic. And I got together with the plants. I talk to plants all the time. Does anyone else talk to plants? We have to talk to plants, right? They are ecologically important here. They're not ecologically important because I said they are or because anyone in this room said they are, but because there are people studying these plants in very in-depth ways to learn more about which ones have the most critical relationships with some of the pollinators and birds and others that we're trying to save. I also picked them if they had some sort of interesting history or story, something to teach. And I threw in something that I know is important. They do not typically get browsed by deer or bunnies or others. And they are all growing successfully in my own yard. And what that means, for those who have not visited, is that they are all growing pretty successfully with very little care. So for all the planting and all the gardening that I do, the things that get planted in my yard really need to be able to survive. Everything gets taken care of for a season or two, because that's only fair. But after that, it really does become survival of the fittest. So I have confidence in these plants that I'm going to feature today. The first plant up to be featured had something that it wanted me to make sure that everyone knew. And that is that the most important native plants for us here in southern New England are native trees. So that means if you currently have some beautiful mature trees growing in your yard right now, you might already be doing more than someone making a pollinator garden on the corner or someone. So really, protecting, embracing, and nurturing our native trees is absolutely vital. And I know that for the last few years, the Barrington Garden Club has been planting a tree for Arbor Day that's been a native tree. Such an important thing, because as much as we have many tall, mature trees, which is wonderful, what we're seeing less of is that new group of trees that people 100 years from now will be enjoying. So we do need to get more of those trees in the ground. So with that, I wanted to feature a tree that not everyone is familiar with in landscapes anyway. The Nyssa sylvatica, which has many common names. And so one of the first things that we can learn is that depending on where you are, depending on where you grew up, we might refer to the same thing in many different ways. Locally, these are often called black gum, sour gum. Pepperidge is what they're called in Connecticut and Massachusetts often. As you go a little bit south, people refer to them as tupelo trees. Now, it's sort of funny because for the longest time, Ed was wanting to plant a black gum tree, and I was wanting to plant a tupelo tree. It turns out we were wanting to plant the same tree, but I knew tupelo trees from my grandmother's house, which was in West Virginia, where they were plentiful along the river there. And these are plants that typically grow along waterways. But, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute, even though they typically grow along waterways, they're very adaptable to residential settings. They don't need to have wet feet after the first year or so of watering. The oldest known tree in North America is this native black gum tree. It's in New Hampshire. It's been estimated at 700 years old. And many of those oldest trees are actually somewhere in New England right now, although unfortunately some of these old growth trees are shrinking. The wonderful thing about this tree is that it is slow growing, but it's truly a legacy tree. And where that's significant is we often focus on getting fast-growing trees in the ground because we want shade quickly. And there's really good reasons to want shade quickly. But many of those fast-growing trees may not be the same trees that are around a few hundred years from now. So it's also important to think about those trees that may grow more slowly, but be here for a very long time. Because in many cases, let's face it, we're planting these trees for a future generation. In our yard, these trees grow to be about 30 to 50 feet, 20 to 30 feet wide in a wonderful pyramid. It's perfect for a residential yard. It gets very nondescript flowers in the spring, but they are absolutely loved by pollinators. And they flower at a time that's critical for early pollinators. And they get fruit in the fall for our songbirds. Now remember I told you that it's a plant that naturally grows along waterways but can adapt to grow anywhere? The reason for that is it grows a very, very deep taproot, so it's able to get down below that surface soil and tap into water that's beneath that. But that also means if you're buying a plant, you want to think about that. Not just what's growing up, but also how do the roots grow and what might that mean? If you're planting a tree that gets a deep taproot, you're probably not going to move that tree. So you want to think about where you're going to put it. It also means that in many cases, you might be better to plant that tree small. We often want to get giant trees, but if you think about something that grows a very deep taproot that's been dug up to be balled and burlapped, that might not be the best idea. The next plant is also technically a tree, but much smaller. Who can think of having gone to the dunes and been surrounded by beach plums? I feel like this is especially prevalent on Cape Cod, but most people in this room, I bet, if you've been to the beaches and the dunes, have memory of this, particularly if you were there when it was flowering or berrying. So this has really been thought of as a dunes plant. But it has made a huge rise in residential planting in just the last few years. And one of the really cool things that the plant is wanting us to know is that it's even happier in our backyards than it is on the dunes. And it grows in a little bit of a different way when planted in a backyard. It grows into much more of a small tree shrub form in that kind of a setting. Now, it doesn't really like to be by itself. You can plant it by itself and it will survive, but if you want it to get fruit and berries, it's going to need to have at least 2 or 3, or, and this also works, we just need to get more of them around town. Because if you have one in your yard and your neighbor has one in your yard and the farm school planted a bunch a year ago, then eventually there's plenty of them for them all to get pollinated and we all get fruit. Now you can leave the fruit and the birds will love it. You can Google how to make jam, and you can make jam, but I will tell you, if you've never made it, it's an arduous process because every little pit has to come out of every tiny little berry before you can make this jam. But you can also make a wonderful holiday liqueur, and all you have to do is throw it in a jar with some vodka or brandy and sugar, mush it around and let it sit for 2 months, and you have a fabulous holiday cocktail. So I have tried it, and I highly recommend it. Our next plant is a shrub, because again, sort of sticking with this theme that we often think of perennials as our native plants, but our shrubs and our trees are also really important. Northern bush honeysuckle is a really, really essential plant here. It plays a vital role for pollinators. It's super good at erosion control and soil improvement and other things. However, we barely use it, we barely know it. This is a good example of a plant where it's important to learn a plant's botanical name and use that botanical name. Many plants we refer to with the same common name, and we're talking about 2 very different plants. So there is also a honeysuckle that's growing all over our wild areas that anybody that has ever participated in invasive plant removal has probably taken part in getting rid of. It is an entirely different species than this plant. So that's, again, you want to be careful because the last thing you would want to do is go wandering into a nursery and say, I'm here for a shrub growing honeysuckle, and end up bringing home the very plant that we're trying to take out of woodlands. This plant does something fascinating with its foliage. It starts out in the spring, naturally, with this really deep red color. It then goes to a greenish color during summer when lots of other things are flowering. And then in the fall, this deep color comes back. So you have it sort of twice in a season. But even more fun than that is what its flowers do. It has a kaleidoscope of colors all on the same plant, and those are connected to pollination. So the flowers start out at that bright, cheery yellow color. They then go to a salmon color and eventually end up deep red. And that happens by virtue of them being pollinated. So on the one hand, that just gives you this super cool looking plant, but it's also a really great example of just how fascinating these plants are. The reason that's happening is because you don't want pollinators to waste energy. And so this is signaling to a bee that might land on this, that if the flower is red, it shouldn't go there. It should go to a flower that's yellow. So you literally have a plant that's talking to your pollinators. So when we talk about how native plants have this relationship, it's so essential to sort of think about and learn about that. On the other hand, in many of our cultivated plants, and this can be true even of native plant cultivars, we often are doing the opposite with flowers. We're creating flowers that are sometimes so giant or double or triple bloomed or other things that pollinators will flock to them only to find there's nothing for them. So they've wasted all that energy. Our next plant is a ground cover, because who doesn't love a ground cover? And even if you have lots of tall plants, including ground covers in your landscape is really important for natural weed control. Viola labradorica. And I think that this one might even be in the resilience garden. I'm looking at Lynn. In Lynn's garden. Okay. All right, that's great. So the thing about Viola labradorica, it is particularly beautiful. I'm going to show you a picture of the foliage in a minute. But like any violet, it does seed around here and there and everywhere. But when this one makes a mat, it's just this absolutely gorgeous, richly colored mat of beautiful foliage. I'm sure you know you can use these flowers and the leaves in various jellies and candies and salads and even cocktails. They're great for sugaring and making decorations with. That violet, just like so many of our other violets, is not a weed. These are essential keystone native wildflowers. This is the only host plant for the fritillary butterfly. So before you get upset with those violets that might have crawled into your yard or your garden, sort of take a minute to learn and think. Now, when we talk about native plants, the term host plant gets thrown around a lot. So I wanted to show that in action, what that term is referring to and why it matters. Has anyone heard of this plant before? It's a good one. All right, so do we know how Antonaria pussy toes, which is a great ground cover, by the way, got its name? So the flower, at some point somebody thought this flower looks like a cat paw, which is very fun. And it really does. If you get down really close to it, it really does. This is an American lady butterfly. This American lady butterfly has found this plant. This is a real picture, my own yard. This butterfly has found this plant and is laying eggs on that plant. Those eggs are tiny. You almost couldn't even see them. As those eggs get bigger, they become a caterpillar. And so this is a host plant in action. It's the plant that's going to nurture these butterflies through their whole life cycle. Now, when they become caterpillars, they do something that can be kind of creepy to some folks. They take the leaves and they wrap those leaves right around themselves. And this whole patch of your pussy toes plants gets very, very messy looking, which a lot of folks don't like all that much. But it's not hurting the plant at all. It's literally what the plant was meant to do. And then when the caterpillar is ready, it's going to find a nearby stem. It might be on that plant. It might be on a plant that's close to it. And it's going to go through the next stage of its life cycle, which is again a reminder of why it's so careful, or it's so important to be careful with our pruning during the growing season, because you never really know what's sort of in those plants. And then at the end of all that, you're back to the next generation of American lady butterfly. But if you intervene at any of those stages along the way, that process gets stopped. And in fact, the American lady butterfly has declined by 60% in just the last 20 years. Our next plant is Monarda punctata. This is a real party plant. Everybody that sees it in any garden gravitates to it. It's fun. It's got this Dr. Seuss kind of vibe about it. But even more importantly, you will consistently see the biggest array of pollinators on this plant of any plant in a garden. Just crazy numbers. And for people who are actually into that, which seems to be a growing thing, this sort of getting really close to bugs and taking pictures of them and trying to find out what they are and reporting them on various apps, this is a plant to go see them on, for sure. It's also very aromatic. It just adds this sort of wonderful fragrance to the garden, and it blooms for a long time. Now, something to know about spotted bee balm. If you want it in your yard, that's great, but it's going to grow where it wants to grow. Now, it's important to plant it at first, but then from there, it might stay in that spot for a year, it might stay in that spot for 2 years, but eventually it is almost guaranteed to go somewhere else. This plant was originally planted probably 4 feet over from this spot, and it decided that it literally wanted to grow in the crack between the sidewalk and the garden, and just absolutely thrived there in the summer. And that's one of the challenges with native plants. It's either a challenge or an opportunity, depending on how you look at it, but many of them do live on through reseeding. And while they might reseed in sort of the same area you originally put them, they're very likely to veer off to somewhere. Our next plant is a mountain mint. Who has heard of mountain mint? Mountain mints are super important in the garden, and they're super important for a couple of reasons. They're really a powerhouse plant for pollinators. The one that I'm featuring here is seen a little bit less often in our gardens. It's called narrow-leaf mountain mint, and it has a much finer foliage, sort of a lime greenish color. The white flowers have a purpley tinge to them, and it's one that sort of fine gardeners, if they're going to include a mountain mint, this tends to be one that they will pick because it does not spread as enthusiastically as others do. Now, when we think about spreading, it's important to keep in mind that this mint is not the same as the culinary mint. If anyone has ever planted culinary mint in the ground, you know, like I do, that it is not a good idea to do that because it will be there forever. This is a completely different species of plant that just happens to share a common name, so that is important to know. However, similar to mint, it likes full sun, it's pretty adaptable, it can definitely handle drought, and this particular variety gets about 2 feet tall by 2 feet wide, so really can fit in almost any garden. A tip with mountain mints, whether it's this one or one of our other native varieties, by mixing this, literally mixing it through the garden, it can help to deter rabbits and deer in the same way that you might take a plant spray and spray it. It has a similar effect of adding this strong fragrance that many animals don't like sort of throughout a space. And in fact, where I have big patches of mountain mint, that is the only place that you'll see some of the flowers like a coneflower or phlox or other things that I otherwise might have trouble growing in a place where the animals live with me. And finally, just a tip on this particular one, it is especially good as a dried flower. It lasts a really long time and sort of mixed in with others, really neat impact. Purple milk, yes?
I wanted to know if it truly is in the mint family.
No.
Highly allergic.
No, so the mint family is mentha, and this is pycnanthemum. So it is a totally different genus. No square stem. No square stem. Yeah. So purple milkweed. We all know, I believe we all know, or I hope we all know, that milkweed is very important for our monarchs. This particular purple milkweed is a real prima donna in the milkweed world. It is rare and endangered in our area, but just like the other milkweeds, it is a host plant for the monarch butterflies. There are actually 7 different varieties of native milkweed right here in Rhode Island. We mostly know common, which spreads very enthusiastically, and the orange butterfly, which is a little bit lower growing, but there are some other really interesting varieties to grow as well. You might be tempted by this one because its flowers are so vibrant. This is a very true color on this. It's a pinkish purple, absolutely beautiful, super well behaved, but something to keep in mind and something to learn from this plant. It will only grow in the most precise of locations. The soil pH has to be perfect. The drainage has to be perfect. So as opposed to common milkweed that you could plant and grow almost anywhere and it's going to spread and thrive, if you wanted this much more beautiful, much more delicate plant, it would still be a great host plant, but you'd need to spend a lot more time thinking about its placement. And one other thing to know, whether it's purple milkweed or any milkweed, is that the flowers and the plants can be very beautiful, but their role is to host this whole kind of funky ecosystem of plants, of bugs, of seed heads. And so if you just cut it back to the ground right after it flowers, which could be very tempting to do because many people would not want something that looks like this in their yard, you're actually disrupting that ecosystem and a big part of the reason why you might plant it. Yes?
When the thing comes up with all the little, they look like little
Yeah.
other things that come out, if I want them to grow someplace else as well, is there any harm in taking them and helping them plant?
There's not. So the question is there any harm in taking the seeds and replanting them somewhere? There is never any harm in that. It can't hurt. One thing to be aware of with milkweed is it does need cold stratification. So if you're going to try to intentionally plant it, you're going to want to bring it in and sort of Google what that means and put it in the freezer or refrigerator first, or you can just sprinkle them around and hope for the best, which is what I would do. Yes. It can't hurt. I mean, that's what the wind does, right? So our next plant is a grass plant, and it's switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. This is by far, in my experience, the easiest of our native grasses to grow, and it's really beautiful and very underutilized in many ways. All of these pictures are of the same straight species grass plant, just changing in coloration throughout the season. Now, one important reason to think about and to feature a grass plant is that our landscapes are very heavily dominated right now by miscanthus grass, the fountain grass. We have a lot of it in private spaces, public spaces, other places. It's become a very invasive plant in our area, so much so that as of this December, you cannot any longer purchase it in Massachusetts, and as of 2028, you won't be able to purchase it in Connecticut. I would like to say the same for Rhode Island, but we have yet to see how that might play out. But regardless, not a great idea to be planting more of it. We already have plenty of it, and we're going to be seeing much more of it come up. But there are great native alternatives to that. For some people, straight species switchgrass might be a little spready, it might get a little big, it might be a little unruly. And one thing I forgot to mention about that native grass, which I should mention, because it's so important not just above ground, but again, thinking about roots, these native grasses, the roots can go down a full 10 feet. Now think about some of the flooding and other things that we've seen in our local East Bay area. When you have grasses in the ground with roots that are down 10 feet, that can be an incredible tool in helping to manage that water. If you don't want the straight species switchgrass, I specifically picked this one because there are some really nice cultivars. Now, this is a whole workshop in and of itself, the difference between a straight species and a cultivar. But basically, with the straight species, you're getting a genetic diversity that gives you a lot of those attributes we talked about. That said, when you're using a plant in a residential setting or in a public space or in a more designed space, there can be a lot of reasons why you might want to use a cultivar of that plant, which has been cultivated to have specific properties. Many times those cultivars were actual natural selections. So not something that was like cooked up in a lab, but someone was out and came across this very unique species and decided to propagate it because it had interesting attributes. Switchgrass has this huge array of cultivars. Some of them only get 2 feet tall. Some of them get more than 8 feet tall. You've got steel blue colors, red colors. There's a whole wide array of choices. And so thinking about starting to incorporate some of these instead of the non-native grasses we've gotten used to using is a great idea. As we move to fall, and we have 3 more plants left, as we move to fall, I'm going to feature an aster and a goldenrod because every garden should have aster and goldenrod for our late fall color and for the pollinators. Many of our native asters can get a bit tall. New England aster, I've seen it. I mean, I think they say it gets 4 to 5 feet, but I've seen it all of 6 or 7 feet. This particular aster is a really interesting one in that in its natural form, it grows about 3 feet tall, but there is a variant on this one. So if you're looking at plants and you're looking at plant tags, you might sometimes see a botanical name and then a VAR. And that's referring to a naturally occurring variant on that plant that someone has identified and is now growing. In this case, it's a horizontal growing pattern. So you've got the same exact plant, but instead of going upright, it's growing outward. And so that gives you like a 1.5 foot to 2 foot mounding aster, which can be much better for some people's gardens. But that's not even the reason I really love this one so much. Oh, I've just done something really weird here. A minute. Okay, much better. As this aster grows, it goes from that whitish mound that you originally saw to suddenly the flowers evolving to a different color. So it then turns a much pinker shade. And as it develops more, it goes to a deep red shade. And it's really fun because if you have this sort of vibrant garden with lots of things going on, what happens is those colors time really well with a change in the garden season as well. So the white tends to happen as you still have those really vibrant colors of summer. And as you move closer to fall, it deepens into that red tone that matches really well with a lot of those richer colors as our leaves start to change. Goldenrod. Who has goldenrod in their garden? That's impressive. Goldenrod is not a big addition to many gardens, but it's probably, after trees, the most important plant that you could plant. It is a keystone plant, and it is an absolutely essential part of our ecosystem. But you do want to be careful, because some of our local goldenrods really spread. Even in our wild areas, they're getting very dominant. But that said, there are a wide array of goldenrods, and some of them are actually incredibly well behaved and don't spread very much at all. The one I'm featuring today has the nickname silverrod, which is because it's not even golden. Its flowers are cream color and they wrap really gently around the stem. It's really beautiful, right? So imagine that contrasting against those fall colors. And it also is definitely not an unruly grower at all. It's clump forming, not running. It stays fairly compact. And I think probably most people in this room know it, but it bears saying, it is not the source of fall allergies. So the pollen is heavy and stays on the flower. It is not a windblown pollen. It's ragweed that's getting us all in the fall. What's important to know about this plant is it doesn't want to be in good garden soil. It actually wants to be in really lousy garden soil. So if you have a spot in the yard that you're struggling with because the soil's not great, or if you wanted to do a rock garden or something, that would be the perfect place for this one. It's also highly salt tolerant. So anyone planting along the coastline, this is a great one for that. Our last plant I'm going to surprise you with the message that some of the very best plants can be unexpected and not purchased at all. Virginia creeper is actually a very beneficial native plant, and in fact is now being widely cultivated for sale because people who don't have it coming up in their yard are wanting it. For the first time last year, we had people asking us for it, and we did even bring it in to sell. So as you're out sort of fretting about having it in your yard, because I know many do, we used to be in that camp, right? Because there's a lot of things that people think about this. It actually grows vigorously but hurts nothing. It won't hurt a structure, it won't hurt a tree. It creates a wonderful ground cover if it doesn't have something to grow on. But most importantly, it generates highly nutritious berries for birds right at that perfect migration and fueling time. Many people think it's poison ivy, but the leaves are different. As someone who's very allergic to poison ivy, do learn the difference, because the last thing that I would want you to do is being out nurturing your poison ivy. I do let poison ivy grow. I will say it's also a native plant, but you do need to use a lot of caution around that. So with that, I just want to say and close with, there's a lot to learn and a lot to celebrate about native plants. I know that you have sister, I don't know what you technically call them, but there are other garden clubs in Rhode Island that are part of the Garden Club of America. And a few years back, they started a national initiative to declare native plant months. Today, in about 2.5 hours, there's going to actually be a hearing at the State House to take up legislation to permanently designate May as Rhode Island Native Plant Month, to provide a platform to sort of celebrate and educate on these plants. So they are becoming even more important. They're becoming important in schools, in garden clubs, and in other places. And with that, I will just say, come visit us this season, but also please be sure to use our website. It has a ton of resources where you can learn more. And I'm always available to ask questions. Thank you. Does anyone, I know we're a couple minutes past 2, but if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them or feel free to stay after, Joe. Of course.
Our backyard, that's the bike path, then it goes downhill, but everything wants to grow from the side. I don't know what the name of some of those things are. My neighbors call them Japanese bamboo. I cut them all cut back and they stay back.
Yeah.
But it's fun to take the lawnmower down there and cut it like this.
Yeah.
Is there anything I could do back there that I could plant there that would keep them from coming in from the sides?
Yeah, so I mean, a good question is just general. It sounds like it's probably Japanese knotweed. We do have a big problem along our bike path with invasive plants for sure. In general, with invasive plants, a lot of repeat cutting, although with knotweed, that is a particular one. You have to be careful with that. But planting, if you're trying to actually eliminate invasive plants, actually planting things that are very aggressive is a good idea. So that is where you want your really tough goldenrods, your really tough grasses, those kinds of things. But happy to talk about that particular yard situation with you after too. But yes, I mean, it is a great idea to use plants to kind of take on some of those tough plants.
It's good God made machetes.
Yeah. Other questions? All right. Yes. Oh, yes.
Do you have other crop-forming goldenrod?
Yes. So a really great one if you want the bright yellow. Solidago nemoralis, which is called gray goldenrod or old field garden. That's a very popular one in the horticulture industry because it is clump forming and it stays very well managed and behaved, but it has the beautiful yellow flowers. And there's a couple of other ones too, but that's a good one. Blue stem goldenrod, the cesia, is another one which can also take part shade. Yeah.
Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
yes, yeah, thank you.